Well, what a better way to start this conversation than with this extraordinary music by Nino Rota. As you know, Post-Classical Ensemble, we have been always very involved with film, especially with extraordinary composers like Bernard Herrmann. You remember we did that beautiful festival at the National Gallery of Art. Some of you might remember that we restored three extraordinary documentaries from the New Deal, The Plow That Broke the Plains, The River, The City, the first two with music by Virgil Thompson, the last one music by Aaron Copland. And one of our greatest achievements also in recording was to restore the music of an extraordinary film by Paul Strand, a cinematographer, and the great music of Silvestre Revueltas. The director was Fred Zinnemann. It was actually the first film that Fred Zinnemann produced and directed in Mexico. So tonight we have two extraordinary friends and colleagues joining us. And let me start with Dr. Claudia Gorbman, who is actually our guest curator for this program. Dr. Claudia Gorbman was instrumental in launching the study of film music, which began in earnest in the late 1980s. For her PhD, she got the idea to combine two of her passions, movies and music, by studying the alchemical workings of music with film. Her book, Unheard Melodies, Narrative Film Music, appeared in 1987 and has been read in university courses since. Professor Gorbman has taught literature and film at Indiana University and is Professor Emerita of Film Studies at University of Washington-Tacoma. She directed the University of California Film and Critical Studies program in Paris. Professor Gorbman has authored or edited several books on film music and sound, including the Oxford Handbook of New Audiovisual Aesthetics. She has also translated books from French, notably books by critic and composer Michel Chion. Welcome, Claudia. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you. I feel so famous in that introduction. Thank you.
Well, this is you. This is you. Your incredible. I mean, I just reduced your incredible accomplishment to the minimum. It is a great pleasure to introduce you, my dear friend and colleague at Georgetown University, Dr. Robyn Stilwell. Robyn is a musicologist whose research centers on the meaning of music as an expression or impression of movement through space and narrative. Publications include essays on Beethoven and cinematic violence, musical form in Jane Austen, French film musicals, classical psychoanalytic film theory and its implications for listening female subjects, and the boundaries between sound and music. Current projects include studies of oral media, radio, broadcast, audiobooks, podcast, and audiovisual modalities of television. Robyn, welcome. It's great to have you with us. So,
Thank you.
Of course, let's start with Claudia. Claudia, why don't you give us an overview of Rota as a composer, Nino Rota as a composer, and also the films and the directors with him that he worked with?
I need to tell you that my computer is acting up, or my internet connection, so I hope I don't disappear. Rota was born in Milan from a very well-to-do family, a musical family, in fact, and he was somewhat of a child prodigy. He wrote his first oratorio at age 11. and that was performed in Milan and also in North. Two well-known Italian composers at the time in the 20s, Ildebrando Pizzetti and Alfredo Casella, who both belong to a kind of movement of composition that sort of undid all the excesses of Romanticism and advocated a spare kind of style that owed a lot to classicism, but also modern 20th century composers. And something that really influenced him was 2 years as a student at the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia. So he was in the US for 2 years, still studying with another Italian composer there. And there he met Aaron Copland, the young couple in love, Giancarlo Menotti and Samuel Barber, and was friends with them. And was composing, getting all kinds of influences, not only of his European upbringing, but all of the American popular music and all kinds of styles, which he became so fluidly adept in, and which you can hear, especially in his film music. He composed for film starting in the early 50s, and he's probably best known for his work with Federico Fellini, which is how I discovered him. He scored all of Fellini's films up till 1979, up till his death. He also composed the music for The Godfather, parts 1 and 2, and Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, 3 films by Visconti, and numerous other movies. He scored well over 150 films. But he was a non-film composer as well. He is responsible for 84 orchestral and chamber works, 10 operas, 5 ballet scores, and did the incidental music for 10 plays as well. So what's wonderful about this concert is that you'll be hearing a lot of his non-film music to get a sense of the breadth and beauty of his work.
Precisely on that point, Robyn, what is the difference between writing for film and writing for the concert hall?
Well, it's interesting you asked me that at this point, because I was thinking one of the things that really struck me listening to the concert material is that his voice is so strong that it all sounds like Rota, whatever format it's being presented in. But there are some just technical differences. One of the major ones, I think, is structure. We're used to, especially in concert music, any kind of absolute music without an audiovisual component. We use structure as a way of making the music make sense. So, for instance, 4-bar phrases, 4-measure phrases, patterns of repetition, large-scale development, which we might think of as a kind of theme and variations, which I'm sure we'll talk about with regard to Rota, because he liked that. And that kind of predisposes him to be able to write film music, because one of the major ways in which conventional film music works, and I'll say conventional, that's a whole other discussion, but most of the film music that we listen to works on some sort of theme and variations. It's often sometimes called a leitmotivic idea, where there's an idea, a motive, or a theme that's introduced. It's associated with someone or something. And yes, this is borrowed from Wagner, but that's a whole other discussion. But then there are variations. Mildred Pierce is one that comes to mind. We have this very distinctive melody that belongs to Mildred Pierce, and when she's sad, it's in minor, and when she's happy, it's a little bit more sprightly, so that the variations actually reflect emotions of the narrative. That's a very simple way of saying that. But one of the things about film music is that it often doesn't have that kind of almost geometrical structure that we use for other kinds of music, because it doesn't need it. The visuals help structure it, but two, it actually needs to be flexible so that it can be shorter, it can be longer. Phrases often, and themes in particular, often don't come to a close. They're open-ended, and that's so that you can continue it in a different way. You can go on to a different theme. You can move to just busy work if it's action. So it's a much, critics would call it a much more fragmentary process, but that's coming from the perspective of sort of orchestral, absolute, non-audiovisual music. My argument would be that it is more shaped to, or shaped with, the audio visuals, and that can depend on how the process goes. But I would also say that, especially with Rota, and there are a few other composers who compose for film, often have a dance component to it, because movies move, and dance is movement, and that's how I got into it. But I came in basically through ballet, so my interest leans towards the evocation of, or accompaniment of, we'll talk about that a little bit later, movement. But those also often reflect emotion. So that's slightly scattered, but also slightly simplified. I think answer to your question.
Absolutely, you did beautifully. So, Robyn introduced something very important in here, which is dance. So, Claudia, one of the pieces that we have chosen is actually a ballet, Le Molière Imaginaire. Tell us about this topic of dance in this work, and in general, what Robyn already started talking about, dance and film, etc.
I hope that I'm being heard, because I'm
Yes,
hearing only part of what everybody's saying.
Oh,
Am I
I'm
coming
sorry.
through? Good. Okay.
Yes.
Le Molière Imaginaire, that piece is, it's a ballet that Maurice Béjart, the extremely important 20th century French choreographer, had done, and in conjunction with Nino Rota in the 60s, I think it was. It's not my favorite ballet that I've ever seen on YouTube, but some of the music is really terrific. It's about Molière, the life and death of the famous 17th century playwright. So one of the most wonderful scenes is when the king, Louis XIV, first appears in the ballet. He kind of comes out of this set of a sun, and he's splendidly dressed. And then all the dancers surround him so you can't see him. And he emerges almost naked. I mean, I think he's wearing a leotard, but that's about it. It's quite splendid and quite Béjart-like, right? The modern dance stuff. And the music for the ballet is, at points, is really splendid. And I think that you've selected some of the great pieces. The whole ballet begins with a figure who is Death. It's a woman dressed in black, and she comes onto the stage and sits down at the piano and plays this lovely little solo waltz da 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 da. It's just beautiful. And I wanted to point that out because the next, let's see, two pieces later in your presentation at the concert, we see the music that accompanies the appearance of the king, which is bum ba-da-dum bum 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 ba-dum. So it's the same melody, but made into a kind of fanfare. And that echoes this idea of theme and variations that run throughout Rota's obsessions as a composer.
Wonderful. Robyn, any other comments that you would like to make about this ballet or in general about dance and film?
Well, yeah, not so much about the ballet, but one thing that I think is to me distinctive. I'm not sure it's distinctive about Rota, but it's a deep fingerprint of Rota. Is that, and it's kind of a combination that his music to me is very dance-like. It is very full of movement, but it's also full of a kind of childlike quality. Even for things like 8½, there's something very, in some cases playful, in some cases kind of nostalgic, but there is also a kind of simplicity, especially to his melodies, that seem. I'm trying very hard to choose words that don't imply anything deficient about this. In fact, I think it's kind of magical that there is this kind of simplicity. You can almost always imagine his tunes in a music box. And a music box in film terms is a gateway to, in two different directions, one to nostalgia and childhood, and the other way to horror. So it's a very rich area. But I do think that one of the distinctive qualities of Rota is this evocation of movement and the way in which it tends also to evoke a kind of childlike innocence. And that works extremely well, and also sometimes to a kind of intense sadness in a lot of Fellini's films.
Precisely, that this is great, because precisely that was my next question to Claudia, which is this kind of this essence of the Italian neorealism that contains this idea of the childhood. We talk about the dark humor too, and also about processions. Tell us a little bit about this very interesting essence in this this kind of work of this Italian neorealist.
So you want to talk about neorealism or processions?
Well,
neorealism.
Why don't you talk a little bit about neorealism, and then we go to this kind of obsession of processions.
Okay. So I don't know whether people listening know about Italian realism, but it was Italian neorealism. It was a movement of filmmaking sort of at the end of and after the war in Italy. There was a desire to make almost documentary-looking films about the devastation and poverty and want and need in Italy after the war. So many really beautiful and very touching and very simple films were made in this period by, Vittorio De Sica and Roberto Rossellini and the very early Fellini and a number of others that are shot. They look like documentaries, although they have actors. One famous one is The Bicycle Thief, a very simple story about a guy who's desperately poor and who needs a bicycle, gets a bicycle. It's his most precious possession. He uses it in his work. It gets stolen, and that becomes, a horrible tragedy in the life of this poor guy. At any rate, so in that era of neorealism, here comes Fellini, starting out his filmmaking career. And I think the idea of the procession is much more typical of Fellini than other filmmakers at the time. Fellini came from the circus, from cartooning, and there's some kind of repetition throughout his films. You see processions. What do they represent? Well, Robyn has been talking about cinema as movement. There's this constant movement. It's the celebration of movement forward, isn't it? In a kind of ritualized way. So I believe you have a clip showing two processions from one scene to another in La Strada, right?
Yes.
Beautiful.
And
What's that?
I need to share my screen. So hold on just a second.
And you'll notice as Robyn is setting this up that the music that you'll hear in both processions is the same melody.
Okay. Hopefully this will work. Sorry. Okay, sorry. I've lost sound now.
Oh, yes.
Uh,
Yeah. So any more
Okay.
comments of this video clip, Claudia and Robyn?
well, it's just um, it's so typical of the sort of early to mid Fellini that here he's showing the young woman who's been rejected by this horrible guy that she's with. And it's almost gratuitous, right? She's sitting there dejected by the road. And then this little circus trio comes along, playing that lovely little tune. And then she follows them to a town where there's some, typically Italian emotional religious procession through a town. And Rota just loves to give us themes and variations whenever he can. So he gives us that same melody being played by the religious people.
Wonderful.
One thing that struck
Go ahead,
me,
Robyn.
yeah, one thing that struck me about this, and I'd been thinking about it, but it finally came to the surface, which is that this is actually also where Fellini in his way is the most neorealist, the most documentarian-like.
No.
Because this kind of procession in Spain and Italy and a lot of Southern Europe is commonplace. And so it becomes a kind of, yes, a ritual within the film, but also a kind of documentation of everyday life, and a religious life in these places. And I mean, it's kind of obvious. It's a kind of I don't think it's actually a salvation or a redemption yet of the character, but it offers the opportunity for that.
Yes, yes, these are possibilities for salvation, which and that is a really strong theme in La Strada, in Nights of Cabiria, and films there in the 1950s of Fellini's. And yeah, it's funny. I remember when I was a graduate student first watching these films, thinking, wow, this is crazy stuff. This is so, and then you go to Italy and you see these things.
They're all over,
And,
yeah.
Wonderful. I think at this point, I would love to tell our audience what we are going to listen to on March 18th and March 19th. So this coming week, Tuesday and Wednesday. And I really hope that most of you or all of you can join us for any of the two performances. So, for film composers, it's always a little bit a kind of, they are very well known by the film music that they compose, but nobody knows the music that they wrote for concerts. The best example is, as you mentioned before, Bernard Herrmann and Rota, as Claudia mentioned, all the music for the concert. So in this performance, we have focused our interest in the concert music. And actually, it has been kind of very well structured in that sense. We have 40 minutes of concert music and 20 minutes of film music. And I cannot tell you how gratifying has been working with Claudia in creating the structure of this music, because, we have all this music that we believe it was the right way to feature this extraordinary composer. I want to thank actually Professor Francesco Lombardi in Italy, who gave me extraordinary ideas about the music to choose. And Claudia helped me immensely in creating a beautiful unit, which is kind of in 4 sections. So we are going to start with something a little surprise that I'm not going to mention. And then we go right to the concert music, the concerto for strings, which is, in my opinion, an extraordinary piece for a string orchestra with, so many interesting influences from, going from Stravinsky, Bartok, Shostakovich, but very, very personal, with a beautiful minuet, kind of a waltz, a very dark waltz. Starting with in minor mode. How do you can dance a waltz in a minor mode? I mean, it's already sad just to listen to something like that. And then we go to the ballet piece that we mentioned, Le Molière Imaginaire. We're going to do 4 moments of the ballet. And then we go to the film music. The Godfather, the main theme. We're going to listen to La Strada, we're playing, of course, excerpts of each film. And then the beautiful love theme from Romeo and Juliet that you just heard beginning this conversation. And then we go back to the concert music with an extraordinary movement from his Nonette, piece for 9 instruments, which is actually a theme and variation in which Rota was a master. From that, another very interesting piece. Who would have thought Rota, writing the music for Amarcord, he wrote a concerto for French horn and orchestra, which is a masterpiece. Beautiful. The name is Castel del Monte, is a ballad for French horn and orchestra. From there, of course, we include some excerpt from Amarcord, and then La Dolce Vita, and Claudia gave us a beautiful ending that I'm not going to spoil, with one of his masterpiece, which is 8½. So this is the program that we are going to present, and I feel the structure is beautiful and is going to be a big impact. I think something very important that we discuss, Claudia and Robyn, in this performance is that the audience is going to be finally, for the first time, without watching the images, watching the stage, listening to the music without watching the images, which I think is very important, so that you appreciate even more the extraordinary quality of the music and the instrument that he uses. For instance, you are going to see a mandolin or an accordion, and you will say, "Oh, I never realized that in this film those instruments were playing there." So, Claudia, any more comments on this program?
Oh, I think it's splendid, and I just wish I could be there in person and see and hear it. But back to that difference between back to the idea of playing film music in a concert. When you're watching a film, when I'm watching a film, I'm not listening to the music. It's part of this overall dramatic structure. And in fact, the book I wrote is called Unheard Melodies, about film music. And so to be able to foreground those melodies, to not have the distraction of a narrative and of characters and of images, is really special. So you can understand the inherent beauty of his composing.
Fantastic. So before we open, Robyn, any more comments on the program?
Well, not so much on the program, but picking up from where Claudia left off. First of all, I should say that I think it was 1989, so a couple of years after the publication, that I picked up Unheard Melodies, and I still teach it to this day. My students still read it. It is, one of our founding documents of the field of film musicology. But one of the things that I'm fascinated with is that placement of music within a filmic context. And certainly in sort of conventional film, it does tend to take a background place. But one of the things that's been happening more recently is a shift in that. But I think that we have, like, where you have moments where music is really foregrounded, but I think you have that already even in Fellini with things like these processions. And I'll just pick up something that we talked about but hasn't come up yet, or we talked about amongst ourselves, and it's really noticeable at the beginning of that procession in La Strada, is that those aren't the instruments playing that music, and the way that it's recorded doesn't sound like it comes from that space. There's something kind of dreamlike about it, and it's like there should be a trombone or a euphonium there, and it's just not. That they're not making those notes. So that mismatch between what we see and what we hear, on some level, I think we notice it, but on the sort of where Claudia talks in her book about, the sort of mutual implication between the image and the music, or even the sort of hypnotic quality of music on the listener, there's a part of us that knows this isn't quite real, and it starts to shift us off into dream territory.
And
And
oh, I'm sorry.
no, I was just going to say, and then the religious procession almost drags us back into reality.
And that brings us into the question of, and I know we should end soon, but the question of how audiences change. When we show that clip here, you're listening to the music. But if
Yeah.
you're in the cinema, in your movie seat, you might not really think about it. Although obviously everybody's listening to this music because we're watching music being played. But if you've ever been to the movies in Italy, I remember going in the 1960s to see Amarcord, in fact, and guys were smoking, there were people standing up, there were people talking to the screen, yelling and screaming. You could hardly hear the soundtrack. And so the conditions of in which the film was made, the sound post-synced, never at the Cinecittà studio, the sound was never recorded on set. So you always have lips that don't match what you hear on screen, and musical instruments that don't match what you see on screen, and so on. Combined with this kind of interactive audience behavior in Italy, at least when I was there in the 60s or 70s, I think that analyzing too closely might it's how we're seeing that film in 2025, which is probably quite different from the conditions under which it was made and seen.
Wonderful. So we would love to open the floor to questions. You can either just ask the questions in person, or maybe type them or send them to our executive director, David Motsur. So, but just show your hand and ask any question you might have. We have, yes, Larry wants to ask something. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say I taught a course called Music and Film in Cross-Cultural Perspectives many times at the University of Maryland, and we used Unheard Melodies as kind of the core textbook. And we always started out with Sous les toits de Paris, which was the first film we used, based very much on your analysis of that. So I'm a huge fan. So I have I have two general questions. First, can I ask, this is being recorded. Will the recording be available later?
I can address that. Yes, we plan to put this on YouTube in the next day or two.
Okay, great. And then for Claudia, I just wondered, have you published anything about Rota's music in your writings on film music?
Funny you should ask. My very first article ever was in Film Quarterly 50 years ago, and it was on Nights of Cabiria and the music. I think that's the only Rota I've written about, but yes. And thank you for your comments.
I only wish the book was still in print, as you do, I'm sure.
Yeah, I've been thinking for years of writing a second edition, and now that I'm in my dotage, I'm doing other things. I'm learning about native plants and involved in politics and things like that. So sorry.
Thank you very much.
So
Thank you.
Thank you.
we have a question in the chat. Just a mention of the composer John Williams, who of course is a giant of film music, and just if anyone has any impressions or comments about him and his work and his stature.
This is a pertinent question because actually preparing, before when we were doing the tech test before this prelude, we talk about composers that orchestrated their music. And actually, Rota and Bernard Herrmann did their orchestrations. And actually, Robyn mentioned John Williams as somebody. Robyn, why don't you tell us a little bit about what was very interesting about the way John Williams works, the process he works with?
Yeah, it's not in sort of in Hollywood, in classical Hollywood, the sort of the Max Steiner model, which Claudia writes about in Unheard Melodies, and it's kind of the basis for a lot of this. They were working so fast that it wasn't that they couldn't orchestrate their own stuff. It was often that they didn't have time to do it. So they would have assistants who would do their own orchestration. And that became kind of a typical division of labor. But later on, you get somebody like John Williams, who was essentially born into the studio system, right? His father was a studio musician. You can see Johnny Williams himself in a late 50s, early 60s television show called Johnny Staccato, starring John Cassavetes. And it's set in a nightclub, and he's the piano player. So he was a jazz musician in that. But he wrote... he had a longtime orchestrator, collaborator, whose name has gone completely out of my mind, and I haven't had a chance to go look him up. But for years and years and years, he was working with the same guy. So they had kind of almost a telepathic way of working. And Williams would write on a 3-staff sketchbook in such a way that his orchestrator knew what he wanted to do. And sometimes, it would literally say like horns here. And that's one of the reasons why I think Williams is so consistent. You can listen to like those 60s television scores to like Lost in Space, and then his most recent stuff, and the orchestrational voice is absolutely the same. In fact, I remember finding out that Williams had originally scored the first pilot for Gilligan's Island, and then for various music union rules, even though his music was used in the series, he didn't get a credit. And I went back and listened to it and the minute I heard it, is like, oh my God, of course that's John Williams. And it wasn't even the melodies, it was the orchestrational fingerprint. So there's the complete gamut of the way in film music that people can work. And Williams is kind of a hybrid between the sort of Rota model, which is he does everything, to the old Hollywood system. And even on like Broadway shows, Stephen Sondheim didn't write his own arrangements. Stephen Schwartz doesn't write it. Well, actually, he writes his own arrangements, but then he will rewrite them. He rewrote some of his arrangements for Wicked, for the film. So there's a wide variety. But Williams also wrote. I know this because I'm a bassoonist. He also wrote a number of orchestral pieces, including a bassoon concerto, which is about trees. It's about trees.
We have a question from David Lee. Please go ahead. You're muted.
Yeah, here we go.
Yep.
About 35 years ago, I studied with Morton Feldman, and he introduced me to a Japanese composer that wrote a lot for Japanese film, and I admired his work a lot, and I thought he was very funny and just a wonderful person. His name was Joe Kondo. Do you have any connection with Joe Kondo?
I know his scores. Claudia, do you know him at all? I'm not sure. I've seen some of the films that of course now I can't bring any single
No.
one
What are you
um
looking for?
to my I know his stuff, but I'm like blanking. Did he do Tampopo?
I'm sorry. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember the films that I've seen of his. Um,
I don't think I've seen any of his films. I've just heard his scores, so you're ahead
right.
of me.
If I know his music, it would be because of the films. Um, and I can't remember now off the top of my head, but I know his name. And when you said he was very funny, I'm like, yes, that rang true to me.
Yeah, he
So
used
I
Faulkner for a lot of his titles, which I thought was great. Anyway, just a word for Joe Kondo. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And we have yes, Mother is also one. Please go ahead, Mother.
Thank you, Angel. I just thought I'd put out the questions. I mean, if it can be answered simply, how was it that Rota began writing film music? Why did he like it? Did he prefer it at all to concert music? Just say a little more about that area.
I don't quite know the answer to that. I know that he got interested in film music in the early 50s, but I don't know. He wrote tons of scores for Italian movies that we've never seen here. So I don't know how he was solicited for the first one or two of them. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that. Robyn, do you have any insights on that?
I don't know, but I just know that a lot of people in that era were moving. I mean, we're moving to film music. It's only slightly later that people start the 40s and 50s. Even Stravinsky's writing film music, not very well, but he's doing it. So
Yeah, but those
yeah,
serious composers who were writing film music were writing for serious independent kinds of films, right?
right,
The River, The Plow That Broke the Plains,
yeah,
etc. And this was just standard Italian comedies and melodramas.
yeah,
So
and yeah, but also, I mean, I'm just going on what some of my friends who are composers, so when they're starting out, they'll do anything, right? They want a gig. And it could just be as simple as he got a gig. But I don't know either.
there's a wonderful story about um, the facility with which he just poured this stuff out. Uh, he had forgotten, or it wasn't communicated rightly to him, or something. But he was supposed to meet a film director, and hadn't remembered that. And so on the train, which was a 2-hour train ride, he wrote about 20 minutes of music.
What a genius. Fantastic. Do we have any more questions, either live or in writing? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Claudia. What a treat. Thank you again for your amazing job as a guest curator. And we will miss you, but we will think of you in every single note of the concert. And Robyn,
I want to say what an honor and treat for me. It's just been wonderful to get to know you, to get to know more of Nino Rota's music, to converse with you and Robyn, and to be part of this. Thank you.
thank you very much. And Robyn, thank you very much for your incredible contributions today.
Thank you.
And everybody, join us Tuesday and Wednesday. Those closer to Baltimore, come to Baltimore. Thank you
And
very
Herbert,
much. Go ahead, please, Robyn.
I was just going to say Herbert Spencer is the person I was trying to remember who was the orchestrator for John Williams for years and years and years.
Thank you all. Thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you.